In this video, we're going to be talking about the general principles behind sensation and perception. In previous videos, we went through the specific senses: hearing, sight, uh, touch, smell, taste, as well as our vestibular system and our kinesthetic sense, and our ability to feel pain and those kinds of things. So we are going to now talk about the general concepts of sensation and perception. We'll be talking about bottom up versus top down processing. We're going to talk about the absolute and difference thresholds, and we're going to talk about sensory adaptation, selective attention, and a little bit on inattentional and change blindness, although those were mostly in the videos from class. So fundamentally, sensation and perception answers the question is how do we construct our representations of the external world? How do we know what's going on around us, right? How are we able to process mentally the things that we're seeing, smelling, tasting, hearing, and touching? So in order for us to be able to do any of this, we have to first be able to detect this external stimuli, these things that are occurring from outside of the body, from the environment. And then we have to then convert that information into neural signals so that our brains can process it. That is really the definition of sensation, right? The processing information being sent from the external world into our brains, into our nervous system. Now, when we collect, organize, or in other ways interpret those sensations, we call that perception. So sensation is just the information coming in. Understanding what that information is perception. So that's really at the heart of the difference between these two things. With the inattentional blindness video, with the moonwalking bear, right? We talked about how the visual information was there the whole time. You just didn't see it because you weren't paying attention to it, right? But your brain received the images of that moonwalking bear, but just ignored them, right? So that was an error in perception, not in sensation. So let's dive into our basic principles here. So again, sensation, or in other words, bottom up, is moving things to your brain, right? Information comes from the outside world up to your brain, right? Or if you want to think of it from sensations, what we normally think of sensation as like a tactile, right? Like a touch thing. So our touch sensations, right? Think of that works too. That information, me touching my fingers sends that information that my fingers are touching from my hands up to my brain, right? It's bottom up. Whereas perception tends to be top down. That's where our brains focus on interpreting the things that we're doing and then sending that information back out. So a good example here is this, right? You're probably reading this as my phone number is area code 555-867-1569. Please call. But if you look a little deeper, or more, not even deeper, just take a closer look, you'll notice some things. You'll notice that the 5 in the phone number is the same exact symbol as the S in is. Same thing with the 1 and the I in is, but also the H in phone and the B in number is the same symbol, as is the D in code and the first L in call and the L in please. They're the same symbol. So why is it that the same symbol, right? Think this is the perception part. The same symbol can mean different things depending on what it's surrounded by, right? So we don't read this as my P-hone numher 15 area coal, like that doesn't make sense to us. So we ignore the ambiguous nature of these things and just roll with the punches, right? And read it as, it should be read. So when we talk about bottom-up processing, okay, we're talking about what we would call feature analysis. So how do you recognize that a capital A is a capital A? Well, with bottom-up processing, you look at the component parts that make up the whole. So you see the two diagonal or slanted lines connected with at the top, and a horizontal line going across the middle. That's bottom up processing. You're looking at the specific image and working up into your brain and understanding it that way. So it begins with the basic sense receptors. Top down processing, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's where the mental processes we construct as perceptions allow us to understand differences. So this is where the role of schemas come in. If you remember that from the first day of class, right? Our mental representations. Um, so here again, you have the same symbol, but we probably read that as the cat, right? Even though the symbol is exactly the same in the middle, we still see the one with THE and the other is CAT because, even though it's a little bit more ambiguous than the other ones we've looked at, because that's what makes sense. We don't see too many words that start with TAE or CHT. We don't see that a lot, so therefore our brain, knowing what we know, fills in the gap. If you were not an English speaker or a native English speaker, you might not understand what that is saying. But because you have fluency in English and are able to read, your brain makes those assumptions. Let's talk about transduction. So how does all of this stuff that's in the external world get into our brains, right? How does it get into our nervous system? And that is the process of transduction. Okay, transduction is basically taking information from the environment and converting it into neural signals. So perception begins with transduction. Um, each of our sensory organs does this slightly differently. As we saw before, our eyes and ears do this by taking waves and breaking them down into neural information, whereas our sense of smell and taste do it through chemicals, through chemical activation, right? These things are all different. So, for example, with light, right, we've talked about this already, that the cones and rods in our retinas will fire when struck with light waves of certain frequency, right? We've already talked about how the fact that there are red cones and blue cones and green cones, and that represents the visible, our visible range of electromagnetic energy. So we're not able to see infrared or we're not able to see ultraviolet because that's just not our biology, right? That's just a part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we will never be able to see. But different animals see things differently, right? So, for example, uh, honeybees see things in the ultraviolet uh, bandwidth there. I don't know if that's the right word, but whatever, we're sticking with it. Um, so you can see the flower as we see it in the visible range. It's kind of hard to see where the pollen might be, or to figure out where the center of the flower is if you don't have strong visual acuity. But for a bee, right, seeing in ultraviolet, it kind of stands out. It kind of looks like a bullseye, right? The center where all the pollen is in that flower is shows much more contrast than it does in the visible range. So different animals have evolved to be receptive to different uh, you know types of electromagnetic, basically radiation. Um, okay, so let's talk about thresholds. So when we talk about thresholds, just like when we talked about with neurons, that there has to be a certain threshold in order for a neuron to fire, sensory thresholds work the exact same way. Some information, while being sent into the eye, is so, like, just use visual examples, is so weak, right? It's either so faint, so far away that we just don't see it, right? This is not the same as inattentional blindness, where you don't see it because you're not paying attention. But this is that it's below the threshold of visual perception or auditory perception or olfactory perception, or gustatory perception, or haptic. How about that? Haptic perception. That's the sense of touch. So we call that the absolute sensory threshold. Okay, the absolute sensory threshold is the smallest amount of input that can be detected by our sensory systems. Each of our five main senses has a different absolute threshold. Now, this is done by average, Okay, so this is an average thing. Some people are better than others, but in general, here are the absolute thresholds for the smallest amount of input that our sensory systems can detect under ideal circumstances for the five senses. Your skin will just barely feel the wing of a fly falling on you from a distance of a centimeter. That's the absolute threshold for our sense of touch. Our sense of smell is one drop of perfume diffused into an entire volume of air in a 6-room apartment. That is, again, think about what it's saying. It's just barely visible, but you'll be able to still detect it. Sense of taste, if you dissolve a teaspoon of sugar into 2 gallons of water, you will just barely be able to taste it. But in 2 gallons in a cup, you probably won't taste it at all. It just tastes like normal water, even though it's actually there. Sound. The tick of a wristwatch under quiet conditions at 20 feet. Right? In fact, here's something you probably don't know. The clocks in our classrooms tick. You might not have ever heard it because there's usually things going on. And even under normal quiet conditions, you can't hear the clock ticking, like say during a test. But if you do pay extra special attention and it's really quiet, you can hear the tick of the clock on the wall. But that is usually below the sensory threshold, or it's not below the sensory threshold. It's just usually drowned out by all the other noise in the room. And then finally, a candle flame seen at 30 miles on a clear night. That is the absolute threshold for sight. 30 miles, one candle. It's really far. That's really far. But again, if it's a little foggy or hilly, or or that candle is 30.5 miles, or you don't have perfect vision, those kinds of things can all impact your ability to see that. So in terms of generally speaking, absolute thresholds apply kind of across the board to all humans, but individuals can have different responses. So let's take a look at that. So there are some people who can detect, say, that candle at, instead of 30 miles, they can see it at 35 miles, right? They have a much lower absolute threshold than the general population. So they would fall in the I'm not even going to try to do slopes or anything, but in the left-hand side of this graph, right? As it starts to go up, it's very low stimulus, but there are some people who will be able to see it. And then conversely, after that 50%, there's some people who might not see that candle flame until it's at 20 miles away or something like that. Again, that depends on the individual's biology and our absolute individual absolute thresholds. But you'll notice again, if you average it out, there's that kind of right in the middle, that sweet spot that everybody pretty much is able to see. So again, from an individual standpoint, everybody has their own. But when we're talking humans in general, that's what we're talking about when we talk about absolute thresholds. Now, there's a name for that, the people who can, or the stimuli that is present but not detected. Okay, so that is the candle at 35 miles for the average person, or the teaspoon of sugar in 2.5 gallons of water. Right? Does that mean that the sugar's not there? No. If you drank those 2.5 gallons of water, you would gain those calories. You would intake those calories from the sugar. You just wouldn't taste it, right? It's below your absolute threshold. Stuff that's there, that's below the absolute threshold, is what is called the subliminal threshold. That is the stimuli that is present, but it is not detected. Okay, it is not detected by the average person. So, that's what, when we talk about subliminal things, that's what that word actually means. Does that mean it's something that like flashes across the screen real fast and makes you want to go buy a Pepsi or something? Kinda, because if it happens fast enough that you don't see it, that could be below your subliminal or within your subliminal threshold. But turns out that subliminal advertising doesn't really have any effects, and that kind of stinks. Kind of wish it would, but kind of glad it doesn't too. So you're not being manipulated by all these forces outside your control. But still, it would be kind of cool if, I don't know, I could flash the word study or something like that, and you would all do better on your tests. The guy can dream, can he? All right, now there's another type of threshold. So we've talked about absolute threshold, which is the average amount of stimuli needed for something to be detected by one of our bodily senses. Subliminal thresholds, right? The stuff that's there that's below that, the absolute threshold. But there is something called the difference threshold. And the difference threshold is basically, when do you notice that something looks different? So, again, 50% of the time, so that's kind of the standard here, called the just noticeable difference, that there's barely enough for you to know that something's changed, but not enough for you to be like, to nail it every time. So looking at these lights, see a difference in the light. Some people say, no, there's no difference here. No, there's no difference here. But yes, this one looks enough different from the ones before. Again, imagine that they're flashed and not just on this continuum. But this line shows, right, that there is a difference threshold. There is this just noticeable difference, and that's what a difference threshold is. So, you can imagine, just looking at I'm trying to think of a good example. If you think of music that's like slowly getting louder and louder and louder, right? You might not notice this. This might happen. Say you're driving in the car, you turn the volume up a little bit. This probably happens to you all the time, maybe actually. So you're driving, you leave the house, your volume's, pretty mild on your car radio. You're hitting the road, you're on a slightly busy road, your volume goes up to overcompensate for the volume and the traffic around you. You hit 95, it's really loud, volume's even louder. You get to school, you don't even notice your music's loud, turn the car off. You come back in after school, you turn it on, and bam, like you're right? Why? Well, every time you turned it up, right, you didn't really notice that it was getting much louder because of the difference threshold. It was below your just noticeable difference. But then when you come back and you go from 0 to that, you're like, wow, okay, that's a big difference. That's what we're talking about, right? That not noticing the small incremental changes, that's the difference threshold. But eventually you will. Okay, I know this is getting a little long and there's a lot of information here, but the next part fits really well with this. So I want to continue talking about it. And that's signal detection theory. So there's this idea, pretty prominent in military circles, that absolute thresholds, that they don't mean anything. Because again, if everyone has different ones individually, then can we do things to make it more likely that you recognize a stimulus than not? Like, what are the conditions that we can create to basically lower the absolute threshold for individuals? What can we do to make it so that you can see that candle flame from 35 miles instead of 30? And how can you then filter out all that background noise, right? That then allows you to correctly identify the stimulus that you're looking for. Another story from one of my classes about teaching AP Psych. They asked one time, they went around the room and asked the veteran teachers who were taking the seminar, what's the most important thing that you teach in AP Psych? And a lot of people were talking about the disorders or social psychology. And this guy, he was a military vet. He was in the Air Force, and he said signal detection. He said it's the most important thing because it saves lives. And you can't really fault him on that. So how does it work? So you can imagine that you're like a radar specialist in the Navy, let's say. How do you know when a missile was fired, or that's just like a dolphin or something like that? How can you correctly identify the things that are threats or real signals and filter out all the noise? And signal detection gets into that. So they look at things like people's experiences, like how good are they just generally at doing things? What's their motivation, right? What's motivating them to do them? How tired are they? Because we know that if you're tired, you tend to miss things. So in signal detection, there's this chart that they use, and it's each thing has a terminology. So a hit is when you respond to the real signal. There's a missile coming. I'd say that there's a missile coming, and there is one. A miss is there's a missile coming, but you didn't see it. A false alarm is when you say there's a missile coming, but there isn't. And a correct rejection is when you say there is no missile coming, and there is no missile coming. You can see that 2 of these are good, 2 of these are bad, right? The false alarm, that could be the boy who cries wolf. If you're saying all the time that these things are happening and they never happen, that's going to be a problem. This also shows up in meteorology. So the example that's used on the slide is tornadoes, right? If you're a weather person and you're on TV and you're saying there's a tornado, you don't want to get that wrong a bunch, because if you get that wrong, one, people are going to stop listening to you, so that when there is a real tornado, they're going to ignore you. 2, you also don't want to miss one, right? You definitely don't want to miss one. Say, oh, don't worry about it. There's no tornado. When a tornado comes through a house, that would be really, really bad. So people need to be trained, right? Again, how to detect the real threat and how to correctly reject the things that are not, in this case, tornadoes. So this is all signal detection theory. What can we do to make it so that you're more likely? How can we manipulate your environment so that you're more likely to get to get more hits, a higher percentage of hits, and get more correct rejections? So there's that. Okay, last thing. I apologize that this is long and there's a lot here, so I'm anticipating questions. In fact, I'm going to throw another discussion board question or discussion question thing up, because I think that worked well last time. So I'll keep that going for this unit. But the last thing we should talk about is sensory adaptation. Okay, sensory adaptation is the gradual decline in sensitivity due to prolonged stimulation. The easiest example is a Band-Aid. You ever put a Band-Aid on and then like an hour later forgot that you had a Band-Aid on, and you're like scratching your arm and you're like, oh, what the heck is that? Oh, it's a Band-Aid. That's sensory adaptation, right? Your skin is basically getting constantly bombarded with something's on me, something's on me, something's on me, something's on me, that eventually your brain just says, okay, fine, we'll ignore that because nothing's changing, right? You rip the Band-Aid off, oh my God, it hurt, right? Why does it hurt so much? It's mostly because your body got used to it. Same thing, if you're wearing shoes right now. You probably forgot that you were wearing shoes until I just said that, and now you're like, oh my gosh, I can feel my shoes. Or the collar around your neck. That's the one I like to say in class. Like, by halfway through the day, you might forget that you're wearing a collared shirt, but then you bring up the fact that you're wearing a collared shirt, and then you go, oh man, I am wearing a collared shirt. This is uncomfortable. But you didn't even notice it 30 seconds beforehand, right? So that's sensory adaptation. Again, it's our senses becoming essentially duller due to continuous prolonged stimulation. And we'll mess around with that cube in class a little bit. We'll talk more about that then. All right, so that's a good place for us to stop. I apologize for the length of this video. I know it's a little longer. Any questions you have, the discussion board will be posted. Feel free to use that or bring them up in class. I'll make sure that we have some time for questions in class around all things sensation and perception. All right, guys, until next video, I'll see you.